Welcome, everybody. This is Jeff Faller with the Apartment Owners Association. It's great to have you with us today. Today, we're going to be talking about maximum allowable rent increases for 2025, 2026. And so you'll hear about when those increases take effect. That's based on the CPI. But before we get into that, just want to thank you for being a member of AOA. And if you're not, want you to know that you can join for $97. And there's a money back guarantee on that within the first year. You get access to all of the forms, and we have a property management advice helpline even that's here for you. We have an office in Alameda, and so we are up in the Bay Area and really all over California as well. And anyway, it's great to have you with us. There are a few live streams you may have just missed. We had a tenant screening crash course that we did. You can find that on YouTube. Just search AOA USA and you'll find that one. We also had a move in, move out crash course. And so in those, we kind of go over some of the forms. We go over things that you need to know. And anyway, so we just are trying to keep you informed because we know that what you don't know may really cost you a fortune. It says for lack of knowledge, the people perish, it says, a wise proverb says. Okay, we are excited to have attorney Sybil Quay with us today. From earning her law degree in Ghana to completing her master's in business law in Colorado, Sybil has built a reputation for excellence. Now practicing as an associate attorney, she focuses on landlord-tenant issues and unlawful detainers, bringing both knowledge and heart to the field. So it's my pleasure to introduce Sybil Quay. Thank you, Sybil, for joining us today. And a lot of people, they might be familiar with Richard Beckman, who's your associate. And so Richard, he writes the legal Q&A. Do you ever help him with that?
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah, I figure you might. But anyway, so thank you for all that you do, because I know that you answer questions for us. You help even review the forms with Richard, the forms that we produce. And so we're thankful for your feedback to help us stay current. And anyway, I just want to hand it over to you and let you go over maximum allowable rent increases for the Bay Area and how to just properly serve those notices.
Thank you, Jess. All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Sybil Quay, and I'm going to walk you through how to properly serve a rent increase notice and what the current rent caps look like in the Bay Area as of 2025. All right. So we're going to dive right into the topics for the day. We're going to first cover the legal basis for rent increases, then the notice requirements and service methods. Then we're also going to talk about the Tenant Protection Act, also known as AB 1482, and we're going to talk about the rent caps in that act. Then next, we're going to talk about the 2025 Bay Area rent increase limits. We're going to talk about rent increase limits in Oakland, Berkeley, and other areas. Then the next topic is the common exemptions from rent caps. There are certain properties that are exempt from rent increases, for example, single-family dwellings. Then lastly, we're going to talk about compliance pitfalls to avoid, and then questions and answers. Section Civil Code 827 governs some of the rules for rent increase notices. However, we also have the Tenant Protection Act, which primarily governs properties which are not governed by local rent ordinances. And so it has statewide coverage. For that, it mostly imposes rent caps on most residential properties, especially if it's a multi-unit. And usually it caps rent increases at 5% plus the CPI. The CPI is determined by the area you're in. So, for example, in San Leandro, it will be different. In Oakland, it will be different. Whatever the CPI is for your unit, that is what you add to whatever the CPI is for the locality in which you're in. You add it to 5%, and that's how you're able to determine the rent increase. However, there are certain places local rent ordinance governs it. For example, Oakland, Berkeley, San Francisco, and San Jose, and they may impose stricter rent increases, limitations. For example, Oakland may impose something like 1.2%, which is low, which is definitely lower than the state Protection Act, which gives you 5% plus the CPI. It may also prescribe certain limitations, like, for example, in Oakland, adding the notice of the RAP to the rent increase notices. It may determine how frequent you may increase the rent and also what is contained in the rent notice, as well as how to deliver the rent increase. Landlords had to landlords had to comply with both the state law and the local ordinances. When in doubt, it's important to apply the most restrictive rule, just to be on the safe side. All right. So the next topic is notice requirements and service methods. As stated earlier, this is mostly governed by Civil Code Section 827. All rent increase notices have to be in writing. They must state the new rent amount. It's helpful to also state the old rent amount and then the new rent amount, probably in bold, underlined, so that the tenant knows the effective date of the rent increase and the amount of rent increase. This could be in a percentage or a value. For example, there's a $12 rent increase, or there's a 5% rent increase. How to serve these rent increase notices? Do you have two methods? You can personally deliver it to the tenant. For this, you just go to the tenant's door, you knock, and then when he or she answers, you hand deliver the notice to the tenant, or you can mail it to the tenant's address. If you mail it to the tenant's address, you must include a notice bearing the notation of the date. That is the notice of a date the notice is being served and placed in the mail, accompanied by an unsigned affidavit saying that you mailed it on this specific date. And that is because you want the tenant to be able to figure out when service is complete, or when, and as well as when the rent increase will take effect, because it will take effect 30 days after the notice is served. If you're using mail, you're required by law to add 5 days to allow for mailing. Now we go into the Tenant Protection Act, also known as AB 1482, and the limitations it has on rent increase notices. So firstly, it applies mostly to multifamily residential units 15 years or older, and any properties that are not exempt under the law. As mentioned earlier, it has a typical cap of 5% plus the local CPI for that region. However, if the local CPI is more than 5%, your maximum cap is 10%. So you cannot increase your rent more than 10%, even if the CPI is 6, 7, or whatever it is. Lastly, you are able to determine the rent increase based on the previous year's rent or the previous rent increase. As mentioned earlier, if the rent increase is greater than 10%, is less than 10%, you need a 30-day notice. If it's greater than 10%, then you need a 90-day notice. And it must be served in compliance with CC 827. That is by personal delivery or mail. So we now go into the local rent increase limitations. For San Francisco, currently the annual allowable rent increase is 1.4%, and this is effective March 1st, 2025 through February 28, 2026. So if your rent increase took effect in January 2025, you have to use the previous year's rent increase and not the current 1.4%. In Oakland, effective August 1st, 2025, the new allowable rent increase limitation is 0.8%. I have included the links in the numbers, so if you click it, you'll be able to find information as well as probably other requirements that you have to follow for the rent increase notices. In Berkeley, beginning January 1st, 2025, you can raise the rent by 2.1%. However, if the lease started in January 1st, 2024, you cannot increase the rent. You have to skip this year and wait to increase the rent in 2026. For Hayward, it seems like they do not change their rent increase from year to year. They have capped it at 5%. The same as San Jose is also 5%. And then Leandro is 7%. However, if you want to increase the rent more than 7% or more than one rent increase in a 12-month period, you have to contact the rent review board. Next, we're going to talk about common exemption from rent caps, and this involves both the Tenant Protection Act and local rent ordinances. With the local rent ordinance, you have to check the specific rent ordinance to see what other properties are exempt, but mostly and commonly, single-family dwellings and condos are exempt from rent increase limitations. This means that you can increase it more than 10%. Basically, you can increase it up to market value. It has to be a reasonable rent increase. You can't increase the rent abnormally. So it has to be something that you can justify. However, if the single family dwelling or condo is owned by a company, then it's not exempt from the Tenant Protection Act. It's only exempt if it's owned by natural persons, LLCs with natural person members, and if the tenant received a proper exemption notice in the lease. So there's this exemption notice that you provide in the lease to let the tenant know that they're exempt from the rent caps and just cause evictions from the Tenant Protection Act. And this should have been provided with the lease. And other properties that are usually exempt from the Tenant Protection Act, as well as local rent ordinances, are new construction buildings. And this is to encourage owners or property owners to build new construction housing and allow them to recoup whatever costs they have incurred on the building. So there's no rent increase limitations on those type of buildings, and it has to be within 15 years. You have to check the local rent ordinances because sometimes these years change. In some local ordinances, it may be less or more than 15 years. Then we have owner-occupied duplexes. So if you have a duplex and you live in one unit, you are not limited by the Tenant Protection Act or usually local rent ordinances in how much you can increase the rent by. But again, like I said, you have to increase the rent, or it's important to increase the rent in accordance with the market value of the property. Lastly, the most common type of properties exempt from rent increases is government subsidized housing, for example, Section 8. All right, I believe we're up to the last slide. These are some of the pitfalls to avoid. The first one is if the property is subject to the Tenant Protection Act, if you fail to give the notice alerting the tenant that is exempt from the rent caps and just cause evictions from the Tenant Protection Act, it means that it is under the Tenant Protection Act. And so if you increase the rent more than 10%, then that is you're not in compliance with the law. Next one, improper service of the rent increase notice. For example, if you post the notice on the door instead of mailing it to the tenant. The third one is misapplying local rent ordinances. For example, if you misread local rent ordinances or fail to apply the rent caps for the particular year. For example, for Oakland, some of the rent increases are effective between certain periods of time. So if prior to August you use I believe it was 1.4, if you increase the rent by 1.4% in January 2025 instead of August 2025, and it happens that the rent increase in the previous year was lower than 1.4, I mean was lower than 1.4, then it will that's an example of misapplying the local rent ordinance rules. And there are consequences for this. The tenant may petition, and you may have to pay back sometimes damages, all of that. The next one is stacking rent increases without tracking the 12-month period correctly. For example, if you increase the rent last year in January 2024, and instead of waiting till January 2025 to increase the rent, you increase it in December. Lastly, violating notice periods. So if the rent increase is more than 10%, you're supposed to serve a 90-day notice to allow the tenant the time to adjust and prepare for the rent increase notice. So if you serve a 30 days notice, it will be ineffective. And this has various consequences. For example, if the tenant fails to pay the rent and you're trying to evict the tenant, it will be a justification for failure to pay the rent. They will consider it an overpayment of rent, and it can cause problems. So it's best to try to avoid these pitfalls and contact an attorney or AOA if you need help. I believe that is all. The last thing is question and answers. You're welcome to send me questions. This is my information, my phone number and email. You're welcome to send me questions, and I'm more than happy to answer.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing that information. Just to recap there, San Francisco, 1.4% increase. Oakland is a measly 0.8%. Berkeley is 2.1%. Hayward is 5%. San Jose is 5%. San Leandro, 7%. So those are what's there. And some of those dates, it really depends. Some of them January, some of them in August. And really appreciate what you shared there with us. And I think a lot of people can, they would think that it's enough just to post that rent increase on the door. And so can you share what are the acceptable ways to serve the rent increase notice?
So according to Civil Code Section 827, there are two main ways. You can hand deliver it to the tenant, or you can mail it to the tenant.
So either.
And when you mail it to the tenant, you must have, we call it a proof of service, but they call it a certificate of mailing. And it's basically a document or notice showing when you place the document in the mail. So if you know you're gonna place it today on Tuesday, June 3rd, 2025, you put that down and you don't sign it and you place it in the mail.
Right. And so if you were to mail that, if it's today's the 3rd, if you were to mail that today, that would be for August 1st rent increase, because you have to have at least 30-day notice, right?
Yes, correct.
Right.
Correct.
And the exemption notice, that was one of the pitfalls. And I just wanted to mention that in the AOA rental agreement and just about any rental agreement, and really our rental agreement since before 2020, it's been in there, whether you're subject to or exempt from the rent control, the statewide rent control, or tenant protections, or AB 1482, however you want to call it. So with the Section 8, are there some attorneys that would argue that you should go by the maximum allowable rent increases in AB 1482, or is it pretty much across the board all attorneys just agree that you're not subject to it at all? What's your
You
thought?
mean Section 8?
Yeah, so Section 8, like whether they're exempt or not. I don't know if.
So, Um, I had a discussion with Richard, and I would say his belief is that if there's for example, let's say Oakland, there's a local rent ordinance governing the whole of Oakland. So in that case, he believes that the Tenant Protection Act does not govern Section 8 in Oakland. However, in the Oakland rent ordinance, Section 8 is also exempt from the rent increase limitations. So it would seem that it's not subject to either the local rent ordinance or the Tenant Protection Act.
Got it. Okay. Great. Thank you for that. And then let's see what else. So, in the Bay Area, the people that are the ones, the units that are exempt are those that are, it's one single unit, like a single family home or a condo, and it's owned by an individual or by an LLC that doesn't have a corporate partner. So I get,
Right.
or it's buildings. It can even be multifamily if it's not older than 15 years. Is that right?
Correct.
So, okay, we got that. And then we have let me share my screen. We also have a little grid.
Should I stop sharing mine?
Yeah, I think you're done sharing yours. Let me see if I can share this one. Okay, let me pick that one, share it, and see if it gets it. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So we have in the AOA forms, this is we use the AB 1482 is what we call it, but it is tenant
Tenant
protection,
Protection Act.
yeah, act. So maximum allowable rent increases. So here, Alameda, Marin, Contra Costa, San Francisco, San Mateo, um, for prior to August 1st of 2025, these were what was the maximum allowable. And then now it's going to be that 1.3. I thought you said 1.4. Is it maybe for
That was for San Francisco.
San Francisco specifically, but for these areas it's 1.3% or 6.3%. So if it's not local ordinance, if it's under the state in these counties, this is what.
Right. Correct.
Right. All right. So this is a nice little handy chart that you can download and look at that. So, well, thank you so much for taking the time to share this information. People need it now because they got to get those things served this month for it to take effect in August. And for some of those rent increases that have been around since January, people hopefully knew about it. But if not, hopefully this has been good information for you and it'll help you raise the rent. And we do encourage people to raise the rent, even if it's $5, like if it's legal for you to do it, raise it at least $5. Do something just so that people are used to getting a rent increase every year. And that way, you do need to keep up with inflation or catch up with the market rate, then you're able to do that. So just a quick little encouragement for you there. And yeah, Sybil, do you have any other thoughts before we end here?
No.
Okay, great. Well, tell Richard we said hi, and hopefully we'll have a seminar coming up in October or so in person, and somewhere in Alameda. We're looking for the best location possible. And anyway, hopefully we'll see you then.
Okay. Sounds good. I'll let him know.
Okay, take care.
All right. Bye.